There are several ways to start using Kendo in your front-end jQuery-based applications. The entire Kendo package can be downloaded, unzipped, and required files can be referenced in your HTML documents. You can also use a Content Delivery Network, or CDN, to request the static JavaScript and CSS files needed for Kendo without having to download and unzip the packages. Finally, you can also install Kendo packages via Node Package Manager, or NPM, to include them in your front-end build process. In this course, we'll be using the build process with NPM, but we'll get to that. First, let's take a look at how to get up and running quickly using the CDN approach. CDN is good because you don't need to worry about hosting third-party libraries. Caching is automatic, especially when using multiple applications that share the same libraries. For example, if there's an enterprise that has 20 applications all using Kendo and jQuery, they will be loaded once from the CDN, cached, and not loaded again even if using another application. In this lesson, we're going to take a look at how to add Kendo UI to our web page using the CDN method. Let's briefly start with the documentation. Here at the doc side for Kendo UI, you have a Getting Started section. This will tell you how to download the bundles and how to install them locally. We're not going to be going through this particular process, but I just wanted to make sure that you know where to find this information. The next item over in the menu is the CDN services. Let's do that in this lesson. All the Kendo UI packages are available through CDN using this format right here. And there are two things we need to get, the CSS and the JavaScript. Let's take a look at how we can do that using our RPS project tracker. Now, if you completed the previous steps, you might already have a version of the project tracker running locally on port 8081. This is the starting point of our application. If you do, go ahead into the terminal and terminate that process by pressing Control-C. So I'm going to terminate all my processes here except for the RPS API. I'm going to leave that running. And you should already have the RPS tracker jQuery project open in your editor. If you don't, go ahead and open it up and open up the source directory. Now to demonstrate this, we're going to be using a different method. We're going to be using a tool called Live Server to serve directly out of the source folder. So the changes that I'm going to be making here are for demonstration purposes only, and they're temporary. We're not going to keep these changes. I recommend you just watch this lesson and don't follow along so that you don't get messed up. If you do follow along and you do get messed up, then you can go back to the download or the git clone, the original git clone that you got. Okay, so here is the page dashboard, and here's the dashboard HTML file. And as you can see, we have a bunch of HTML already written in here. We are not going to need this, so I'm going to close up all the HTML so it doesn't get in our way. And you'll see two script tags at the top. These are the bundles that are going to be generated by Webpack. Since for this particular lesson, we're not going to use Webpack, I'm going to remove these script tags. So like I said, we need two things here. We need CSS, and we're also going to need the JavaScript. And we're going to be pulling everything that we need from CDN. First, let's import all the dependencies that Kendo UI is going to depend on. And there's only one really, that's jQuery. So I'm going to add jQuery script tag, also coming from the jQuery CDN, and that's under the JS here. And we're also going to be depending on Bootstrap for some styling. So I'm going to add the Bootstrap styling from CDN under CSS here. I'm just going to paste that in. Now I also have my own styling for the global styles for the application and the dashboard specific styling that I'm going to paste here as well. This style.css file is this one right here, and activeissues.css is coming from here. As you can see, the head of our document is already getting pretty large. Not that large, but still, there's a lot of stuff to maintain here. This is all going to go away when we start using the build process. Okay, now before we put the Kendo dependencies in, let's go ahead out to a terminal and make sure you're in the right project, which is this RPS tracker jQuery. And we're going to use Live Server, not the script that we used before, not npm run start. This one we'll do later. But you want to use Live Server from the source directory. So I'm going to switch to the source directory and just issue the Live Server command. Live Server is just a global server that I installed using npm. If you don't have Live Server installed, you should install it using npm install-global live server. You might need to do a sudo on that as well. Okay, so Live Server. This is going to start up our project, and this is what it looks like. So I wanted to have some kind of starting point with all the HTML filled in, and some Bootstrap styling so you have something to work with. Okay, so here we are. We have a few buttons up here for filtering. These are just regular HTML buttons. We don't have any numbers showing up here. So when you're working with jQuery in a jQuery project, you would typically have some kind of script, some kind of JavaScript that you're importing, or you would have a script either in the head or at the end of the body tag. I'm going to add one to the end of the body tag here. And what I want to do is fill in some of these numbers for the active issues, closed issues, and open issues. I want to do that using jQuery. So we're going to have a document ready event, which fires, and the shorthand for responding to that event is using this kind of notation right here. I'm going to use the arrow function because now ES6 is supported in the browser that I'm using out of the box. So once the document is ready, I'm going to paste in some code here, and I want to make sure that these particular items are filled in with certain numbers. These are just numbers that are hard-coded here. They're not coming from the server like they will be later, but we just want to have something to see and visualize. So now when I go back to the application, you can see some numbers here. Okay, what that means is that jQuery is up and running and it's working on our page. So we're ready to actually start hooking up Kendo here. Now for Kendo, we also have CSS and JavaScript that we need to set up. The CSS is not going to change, but the JavaScript will be different, and I'll explain that in a minute. So right over here under the Bootstrap import, I'm going to link to the Kendo CDN to import our common Kendo UI CSS. I'm just going to paste that in just like that. This line right here is a style sheet, and we're pulling in the Kendo common minified CSS file. This is all the base CSS that's common among all the widgets in Kendo. So we need to pull this one in before anything else. Now the second CSS file is going to be the theme. The theme can change. We're going to start off with the default theme, and later in the course we'll try out different themes. So I'm going to paste in the default theme, also coming from the CDN. And you can see that in the name we have default v2.min.css. We'll take a look at the list of all the available themes later on. So we're done with the CSS for Kendo. Let's go down here, and after the jQuery import, let's import the JavaScript for Kendo. Early in the course I mentioned that Kendo is split up into the open source core library and the professional UI library. You can use one or the other, you don't use both. So we're going to start off with the core library because we're just going to implement a simple button. So you can see here that the import is kendo.ui.core.min. Now we can start using Kendo widgets. I know that we have a button on the page. We have a few buttons here. In our handler, I'm going to go ahead and issue a command to convert all HTML buttons to Kendo button. Each Kendo component also takes in options, and you don't really have IntelliSense on what the options could be. So if I press Control Space here, this doesn't really help me. So I'll need to refer to the documentation if I'm to edit any of the options. But for now, let's go ahead and specify this as a Kendo button. I'm going to save this file, and Live Server is automatically going to reload my page and convert every button on the page into a Kendo button. So you see these three buttons here. They no longer look like HTML buttons. They actually have nice styling with a Kendo default theme. Well, buttons are nice, but let's take a look at a more interesting component that Kendo provides. So I'm going to add an input here, just a regular HTML input right next to my buttons. And I'm going to call it Date Picker. So if we take a look at this right now, you'll see that there's my regular HTML input next to the buttons. So if I tap inside of it, I can enter text. But now that we're importing Kendo, I can turn this Date Picker input into a Kendo Date Picker. So let's go down here. Here I can use the ID selector, and I'm going to call Kendo Date Picker. And now you can see that it immediately turned into a Date Picker widget. You can see a little calendar here, and if I tap on it, a little calendar slides out where I can select a date. I didn't have to do anything special for this, just select that input and make it a Kendo Date Picker. So Kendo Button and Kendo Date Picker are available in the core Kendo UI package. However, more complex components, like the ones here in the demos that we've seen earlier, Date Range Picker, Editor, Drop-down Tree, these components are only available with the Kendo Pro library. So if you've signed up for the Pro license, then you can use the Pro library here. And instead of referencing this Kendo UI core min.js file, you would reference this one, the Kendo all.min.js file. But you can't have both of them on at the same time, so I'm going to comment this top one out. And if I save this, We go back to the page. We still have the Kendo buttons and the calendar working. But now we have access to all the other widgets. So in this lesson, I just wanted to demonstrate how you'd go about building an application if you were to use the CDN, or even if you were to download these libraries locally and reference them in your HTML files. As you can see, this is going to get quite messy, especially if you have many pages to handle and you have many different script files to separate out your logic and your concerns. For the rest of the course, we're not going to be using any of this. We're going to be using the Webpack build workflow, which we'll talk about next. In the next videos, I'll revert the dashboard HTML page to the way it was when I first cloned the repository. We're just going to reference the vendor.js file and the dashboard bundle.js file. And that's all. And we're not going to have any of this down here. As our application grows, the approach to reference script tags in your web page doesn't scale. This is not only because we're using only JavaScript in the web page itself and not TypeScript, which scales much better, but also because we want to separate our concerns into different files, folders, and different levels of the application. So we want to have JavaScript files as modules that reference other JavaScript files as modules in order to take full advantage of the modern JavaScript ecosystem. This is why modern front-end development workflows involve some kind of build process, whether it's gulp or grunt, or as of a few years ago, Webpack has been dominating the front-end and JavaScript build space due to its powerful configuration options and the ability to work well in a dev environment. The build process will allow you to develop your front-end application as you would a back-end application, where you can split up unrelated functionality into their own JavaScript files and expose them as modules, and then run your build through a continuous integration and continuous deployment pipeline. So that's the motivation for using the build process in our own demo application. You don't need to set it up yourself. Everything is already set up for you, but let's take a quick look at how it's set up so you're aware of what's going on behind the scenes. If you had the previous live server process running in your source directory, go ahead and terminate it by pressing Ctrl+C and back out one directory into our root RPS tracker jQuery project folder. To kick this one off, we issue the command npm run start, and this will start our application on port 8081. Let's take a look at the code. I've defined that start script right here in package.json. So here in the script section, we have a start script. First, it copies a few static files that are necessary to start up the application, and then it uses Webpack dev server to compile all our script, package up all our CSS into bundles, and then serve it from memory. All our code is going to be written in the source directory. However, after Webpack builds and bundles everything, it serves it out of this dist directory. Let's go back to the terminal for a second, and we'll take a look at the output of Webpack. You can see that here with these build comments. And you can see the output files right here. For example, our dashboard bundle, which is the one being loaded with the dashboard page, is 25 kilobytes built. Whereas the vendor bundle, this is the one that includes jQuery as well as Bootstrap JavaScript. This one is 1.67 megabytes. So you can leave this running as we're developing because the dev server is going to be watching our file system for any changes and automatically rebuild the code and serve it. An example of that would be right here. We have this input HTML element that we've added in the last lesson. We don't really need it here. I'm going to go to the code, open up dashboard, and here is our input. I'm going to remove this input and save the file. And if we go back, you can see that the input is gone. Let's take a look at how each one of these pages is set up in our project using Webpack. So in the source directory, we have 3 pages in our application. We have page dashboard, page detail, and page backlog. Let's take a look at the page dashboard folder. So here is our dashboard HTML file. That's what we're looking at right here. And we have an index file, which is the first file associated with the dashboard HTML. I'm going to be talking about the pattern we use in a minute, but think of the index file as everything that's related directly to the HTML file and everything that has to do with jQuery and Bootstrap and manipulating UI directly goes into the index file. Our page backlog also has an index file, and our page detail also has an index file. So what's this other file here, the dashboard page model? Well, remember the separation of concerns that I was mentioning before? Here we're using an architectural pattern that's similar to MVP or Model View Presenter. Model View Presenter is an interface architectural pattern engineered to facilitate automated unit testing and improve the separation of concerns and presentation logic. So here's our model for the page, for the dashboard page. This is a class called Dashboard Page Model. If you take a look at the code here, you'll see that there's absolutely nothing related to the UI or jQuery in this code. This is simply a model for our dashboard page. So this class is responsible for talking to our backend services and maintaining the data that gets returned by those services. All our pages have their own model similar to this one. So there is the detail page model for the page detail, and then there's the backlog page model for the page backlog. If this was directly related to the MVP pattern, the Model View Presenter, then the dashboard page model class will be a model. The dashboard HTML will be the view, because this defines all the markup that actually displays. So this is our view. And then in between, we have this index. You can think of this as the presenter. So this right here, the presenter, glues together the dashboard HTML and the dashboard page model. This is the in-between. Anytime something happens in the dashboard HTML, if the user interacts with it, index module will be responsible for listening to that, usually using some kind of jQuery event. Or later, we're going to bind Kendo UI events as well. And it's going to notify our model what the user wants. And the model is going to go ahead and act on that information by talking to this server API or something else. And then that'll result in some kind of data being updated here, which will let the presenter know that something changed, because the presenter is also subscribed to changes in the model. Here's an example of that. And after the presenter is notified from the model, it can update the view accordingly. So that's the cycle that we're looking at here. This kind of separation would be difficult to achieve if we just had all our JavaScript in the HTML. It's quite possible, but it's not easy to do. So now that we know that dashboard.html is already set up as far as all our scripts go, we don't need to add any more scripts here, which is good. Everything is going to be packaged together by Webpack and put into this dashboard bundle. We can work directly with our code, which is the index and the dashboard page model, and know that everything will end up working together. We import our Kendo libraries inside of index, and we do that here because index is our presenter, so it's related to the UI, whereas we don't do it in the dashboard page because here in the model, we want to keep this testable. We want to keep this completely separate and not UI related. Okay, so here we have two sections like we did before. We have our CSS being imported, and we have our JavaScript being imported. So we're going to start off with getting our Kendo components installed and imported here. And because we're using NPM now, we're going to install our Kendo components via NPM. I'm going to head out to the terminal, and I'm going to terminate my running process by hitting Control-C here. And I'm going to install a couple of things. First, let's get Kendo UI, the library, installed here. And I'm going to use the full Pro library so we get all the components. npm install, and I'm going to save this into our dependencies in package.json so that this can be reproduced by other developers in the team. And the package we want to get is namespaced at progress/kendo-ui. Once that's installed, let's go ahead and kick off our application, npm run start. Now this will open up a new window every time you run start. So I'm going to close out all the old windows here. Now the first thing I want to do is convert these filter buttons to Kendo buttons. Right now they're just plain HTML buttons. We'll take a look at the process of how to do that next. Now that we have Kendo npm packages installed, we're free to use all the Kendo UI components in our application. Let's go to our code and open up the index file. Right at the top, we have our Bootstrap CSS, and then we have our own application CSS files here. Right after Bootstrap, I'm going to import the Kendo UI CSS. Just going to paste that in, and that's pointing directly to a CSS file in the Kendo npm package that we've just installed. You can take a look at that directly here. It's in the node modules folder at progress, Kendo UI, CSS, web, and then there they all are. So we're using kendo.default v2 min.css. You can see that you have an option here. You can use less, you can use the unminified versions, You can use V1 or V2, and there's lots of different things here. We'll take a look at this later. So for now, we just want to get this default V2 minified file in here. And we also want to get the JavaScript. So I'm going to go over here and I'm going to import at progress/Kendo UI. And you can see Visual Studio Code is really good at helping me out here where I want to import from. It's going to give me the paths so I don't have to remember them. JS. And then you get to pick what you want to import. So you have lots of different options here. We'll get into what this means in a second. But let's get this all library, Kendo all. This means we're going to get all the different packages all in one call here. Okay, now we have it imported, and that's great. But we're not creating any Kendo components on our page yet. Let's take a look at the dashboard HTML file. Here we have our filters for the dates, months, 3 months, 6 months, and 1 year. These are the 3 buttons right here for the filters. So these are the ones we want to convert into Kendo buttons. And they have this class that we can use. They all have the same class. That means we can just use that class as the selector to convert these into buttons. So I'm going to copy this class, go to index, and it looks like we're already doing something here. We're attaching the click event so we can filter. Great. So we already have these selected. I can just add Kendo button here to that selector. If I open the parens, you'll see that I have options here as well. I can just convert it to Kendo buttons like that. Or as a second option, I can add the Kendo UI button options as an object. Let's just leave it without any options right now. We'll still have the click handler attached, and I'm going to save this. Let's go take a look. Okay, so here's our application, and as you can see, these have been converted to Kendo buttons now. The filtering still works because our click handler is still attached, but now we have the fancy Kendo styling on it. So that's really nice. Let's take a look at something else. This is the output of our bundling. If we scroll up just a little bit here, you'll see that the vendor bundle right here is 11 megabytes. Now this is in the development environment, so this bundle is a lot larger than it's going to be in the production environment. But I want you to take note of that number, 11.8 megabytes for the vendor bundle. And that's because we're wrapping up all these Kendo modules, everything into there, including jQuery and Bootstrap. So it makes a pretty big bundle. Now, what we can do is instead of just using the entire Kendo library here, we can use only what we need. So for example, on the dashboard page, right now, I'm only using buttons. So instead of importing all the components, the grids, the scheduler, the chart, all the Kendo UI components, I'm going to comment this line out. And instead, I'm going to import just the button component. So add progress, Kendo UI, JavaScript, Kendo, button. So this will still give me the button that I need, but it'll only import the JavaScript for the button. So this will make our page load much smaller. Let's take a look at the result. And the buttons still look the same. They're Kendo buttons. But let's take a look at the output here. You can see that our vendor bundle is now 2.28 megabytes, a significant decrease. So from now on, we're going to be importing only what we need. Now, during development time, you can just import Kendo all and be done with it, of course. But then you might forget to remove that when it comes time for production push. So I recommend that you only import what you need. So I'm going to remove this Kendo all import. And right now we're just using the button. One other recommendation. We're going to be using Bootstrap styles and the Kendo default theme, and also the global styles for our site. We're going to be using these throughout all our pages. So it makes sense if we share these imports. And I'm going to do that. Not only is that going to be helpful to share the imports, but also if we ever need to change the theme, which we will later in the course, we can do it in one place and not have to go searching around for the theme and change it in multiple places. Okay, so we have this shared folder here. I'm going to create a new file called style imports. And in this file, I'm going to have these 3 lines. I'm going to cut them out of here and paste them here. We have our Bootstrap import, Kendo default theme, and the global styles.css. And here, I need to import that so it becomes part of the build. Shared, and then style imports. I'm going to save everything, and there we are. We still have the buttons here. Now notice something. If I tap off of the buttons, none of them are selected. So I don't know which one I tapped on last. And there's a way to fix that. Kendo UI provides something called a button group.
anytime we want to have a new component, I'm going to recommend that we go to the documentation, navigation. We have this button group and overview, and this will give us the documentation of how a button group can be used. So I'm going to apply a button group to group all these buttons together and give us one valuable thing that we can use, and that's to have one selected button at a time. So let's head over to the code, and in dashboard HTML, I already have a button group surrounding all these buttons, but this is a bootstrap style. I want to have my own class here so I can select it, and I'm going to call it PT range filter group. Let's go ahead and copy that and go into our index file. And instead of importing this Kendo button, I'm going to import the Kendo button group. And down at the bottom, I'm not going to convert these to Kendo buttons anymore. However, I will select that new class, PT range filter group, and call Kendo button group on that selection. Let's save everything and take a look. Okay, now when I tap 3 months, that button stays highlighted. If I switch, then the button group handles which button is going to be highlighted. We're going to proceed to the next chapter where we're going to implement a few more of these basic UI components.